Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Sophie. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening and to welcome all of our virtual visitors, our online attendees. We've had over 200 bookings for this conference, and it is really fantastic to know that it's a real legacy of the work we've been doing with our engagement and learning team, that we have such a diverse and exciting international audience who I know will be tuning in and asking many questions as we come through the next packed 4 days, as much as we will be having a conversation in the room. So thank you for that and welcome everybody to IMMA. As Sophie said, I'm the director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and I'm really excited to think with you. I guess this is what we would call a research conference, but also kind of a speculative situation in which we try and locate our experience of art and culture here in Ireland within a global context. For me, it was very important to start to think about what we're looking at, and for our international visitors, they may not know as much as we really know here about the decade of commemoration. We've been really thinking about obviously 100 years of the establishment of the Irish state, but really we started imagining and reimagining and rethinking the kind of momentous events that got us there, if you like, right from 1913 right up to the period of 2023. And art and culture, I think, has led the way in terms of thinking really excitingly about what sometimes might feel like an overdetermined history, one in which we maybe think we know all the protagonists and the participants. But this perhaps is a chance to open up again certain debates or ideas or even locations from which we imagine the Irish experience and connect it within our place within the world. So I was really kind of intrigued very much when I was thinking about the decade of commemoration, and when we were tasked to try and think a little bit about the periods 1921 to 23, not an easy part of our history. And I was particularly kind of wondering and reacquainting myself when I came back to Ireland to some of the debates and some of the key figures and characters who were often cited and quoted in relation to perhaps when we thought about art and culture in relation to this period. And in fact, this particular quotation that sometimes floats around within our discussion of this conference from Arthur Griffith, where he suggests or calls for us to mobilise the poets, is in fact a kind of quotation that has been used many times in the commemoration recently, and it's a particularly interesting idea. He was writing from Gloucester Prison in the 23rd of January 2019, and it's a very kind of practical document that that this quote comes from, which is an extract from a memo on Dáil Éireann policy, so the Government of Ireland policy, which was attached to a letter coming from him while in prison. So it shows the kind of deeply unstable kind of situation in which they were trying to formulate the government and kind of think about how to kind of really connect with allies and think through the establishment, this new establishment of the Irish state. And yet he was thinking very ambitiously and strategically while imprisoned himself. What sort of fascinated me, and the quote itself is very simple, the bit that is often cited, where he says at the very end of the document, "Mobilise the poets, let them address Wilson," meaning Woodrow Wilson, "and let them remind him in their best verse that he has the opportunity and the duty of giving the world true peace and freedom." So a stirring kind of evocation, and kind of an interesting one in terms of him thinking about how to mobilise the poets. I guess he thought they were the main characters or the main vehicles or the main carriers of culture at that moment in Ireland. And again, even that trope or that truth is one could question whether our entire culture was always based in the literary, as we so often think. And I thought that already, of course, was very interesting to try and understand who were not only these poets, but who might be the cultural protagonists who were involved in the independence movement here in Ireland, and what kind of role did they have. But as I said, this has been dealt with quite a lot, and many people evoke this quote. But more interestingly, I thought in this rather, as I said, strategic document where he's literally laying out the plans to try and think about how to galvanise a certain group of allies together to think and to push through and to mobilise, in fact, for Irish independence. What I found very interesting about the document was the kind of places and allies that he was evoking or thinking about. So he was really sort of writing to his colleagues and asking them to think about the peace conference, so the Grand International Peace Conference. And of course, we're talking about the interwar period, the period between the First and the Second World War, which of course elicited many changes. And I was just intrigued by who he thought those international colleagues might be. And I thought that this might be a really interesting starting point for us within this commemoration period to start to think about what was the sense of internationalism at that moment in Ireland. Who were those potential allies? What were the freedom movements or the strategic partners who he was trying to evoke at that time? And so he sort of mentions very many. He sort of talks about the South American states and how they might talk back to Woodrow Wilson at that time. He evokes Nicaragua, Guatemala, Venezuela. But then he gets really into the nitty-gritty of how he imagines a kind of movement around Europe. And he's talking about the European countries that should be individually dealt with. He's looking at Serbia, he's talking about Italy, Germany, and again, imagining this in this moment of the interwar period, Belgium, Australia, and Portugal. He says, remind Liberia and Haiti that Ireland is the only European country that never engaged in the Negro slave trade. Remind Bohemia, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria of the similarities of our struggles. There's a nice part of it here where he says, there is a very able Sinn Féiner of high standing in Brazil. So it's sort of fascinating to just think about where he's imagining those allies or those movements that might aid in the debate about independence movements or freedom fighting of all kinds, or that oft-used term, the sort of aspiration for self-determination, perhaps against colonial powers or against empire, might be emerging from. So that's what I kind of kept thinking about afterwards when I was trying to think about how we might formulate and recontextualize or think about the position of culture now in relation to remembering this very complicated period. I wanted to think about how do they understand or think internationalism, and how would that or might that relate to how we might think about it now. And to that end, it became fascinating to sort of understand what was that period. Of course, it was a period of great change. It was a period of trauma post-First World War. It was a period of the collapse of many empires and the redrawing of certain ones in many ways, which seemed to unleash a certain kind of energy and a certain set of aspirations among many populations all over the world. And to that end, we started to look at the emergence of new states in Europe and in the surrounding areas, and further afield also. And to that end, we started to reach out to our much respected colleagues, many of whom are here in the room, to start to really question what was happening in these emergent states as they defined themselves. What kind of statecraft were they deploying, and how were they thinking aesthetically about that new state? It's a tricky question, and again, over these days, I'm sure we'll also come back to the idea of what does it mean to think self-determination. You know, we're veering into what was unknown then, the essential nationalism and fascism that was to come. But there was a moment of moments, perhaps, in this interwar period, sort of a sense of energy and possibility that was coming. And many of these states perhaps were invented and thought through and collapsed, or many still have sort of developed today. Perhaps some are popular sovereign states, perhaps some are autocracies. There's all kinds of things we know now that are not what I was focusing on. I was rather wanting to think, what was that energy, that sense, and that aspiration, and how were artists and others engaging in it, and to that end, not only in relation to perhaps fighting power and articulating an idea of self-determination, but also how did we think and aestheticize official culture in these new and emergent states? Was there a sort of an overthrow of a certain type of aesthetics, and was there a development of a new one? So there are all kinds of really fascinating questions that I think we might start to grapple with over the next few days. So I won't take too much longer of your time, because I really do want to get on to the incredible speakers and lineup that we have. But I would like to just take a moment to thank so much many of our international research colleagues who have agreed to participate and think with us about these very complex and puzzling questions. And especially Paul O'Neill, who's here today, Meric Unner, who also, I'm delighted, is here today from Istanbul. We also want to thank Merv Elverin, Marco Yenko, Lisa Godson, and Hussein Omar. And also Stephen O'Neill, who's part of the group who wonderfully developed this conference, all of whom are the researchers who we asked to think with us, to question us, and to disabuse us of silly notions. And it's been a really wonderful journey already. And of course, this project and this conference that will kick off today is really the major public sort of dispositive this year that will lead into a rather grand large-scale exhibition that we will have next year in the sort of fall and winter of 2023 around this really hotly contested term, self-determination. I also really want to take the moment to thank very much Lisa Moran, Stephen O'Neill and Sophie Byrne and their fantastic work in convening and thinking through this conference. And Nathan O'Donnell, Joanne Mullins, Stephen Taylor, Barry Keogh, Monica Cullinan, Ella Litta-Byrne, Patrice Malloy, Aisling Ivers, Maeve Higgins and Elena Quintina, who really worked so hard on bringing this together. So that's all from me at the moment. I'll be back later, and I hope you really, really enjoy these few days, and thank you so much for coming.